Kaydee kept getting closer, then Shadow finally set a boundary. For days, Kaydee had been doing something that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. She kept showing up. When Shadow moved through the familiar territory around Big Bear Lake, Kaydee was often somewhere nearby. When he visited the nest, she appeared there too. When he settled into one of the familiar trees, she sometimes moved closer, and on more than one occasion, the distance between these two bald eagles became surprisingly small. At first, Shadow seemed willing to tolerate much of it. But then something changed. Kaydee approached him again. She moved close enough to make contact, and this time, Shadow responded. Not with the kind of reaction that would necessarily drive another eagle out of the territory, but clearly enough to communicate something important. He wanted space. For anyone watching Shadow and Kaydee closely, this may be one of the most revealing stages of their developing relationship so far. Because the question is no longer simply whether Kaydee wants to be near Shadow. She clearly keeps returning. The bigger question now is what Shadow is willing to allow, and what happened afterward makes that question even more interesting. Because even after Shadow began setting boundaries, Kaydee was still there, and Shadow didn't disappear either, the eagle who kept returning when Kaydee first began appearing regularly around Big Bear. No one could know where these encounters would lead. Shadow had occupied this territory for years. Kaydee was the newcomer, a young, banded female bald eagle who had begun spending more and more time inside a landscape already filled with familiar places. The nest, the surrounding pines, lookout snag, and the trees used for roosting. Simply seeing two bald eagles in the same territory doesn't automatically mean they are forming a pair. That distinction is important. Eagles can share airspace. They can tolerate one another. They can investigate the same resources, and individual interactions can be difficult to interpret without seeing how behavior develops over time. But Kaydee wasn't appearing just once. She kept coming back, and gradually the interactions became harder to dismiss as isolated encounters. One particularly important moment came when Kaydee followed Shadow to the nest. The two spent more than 10 minutes there together, and instead of Kaydee simply sitting on a branch and watching, both eagles became involved with the nest itself. Sticks were moved. They occupied the same structure, and at one point, the physical distance between them almost disappeared. Their beaks touched. Kaydee appeared to nibble or preen around Shadow's beak and feathers. Shadow didn't simply abandon the nest, but neither did he accept every approach without reaction. Even during these close interactions, there were already hints that he had limits. That detail would become increasingly important, because Kaydee seemed interested in closing the distance. Shadow seemed more complicated. Then the pattern grew. The following days brought more observations. Kaydee continued visiting the nest. She rearranged sticks. She appeared around perches Shadow was using. At times, the two were seen close enough that viewers naturally began wondering whether something more significant was developing. But the most interesting detail may not have been any single moment of contact, it was movement. Who went where and who followed. During one observation, Shadow left a perch. Kaydee followed only moments later. That doesn't prove why she followed him. We cannot know her intention from a camera image, but when the same eagle repeatedly responds to the movement of another eagle, it becomes something worth watching. Then another interaction added a twist. There was an occasion when Shadow himself appeared to move after Kaydee. Again, appeared matters here. Flight paths captured on a remote camera can be difficult to interpret, and following another eagle isn't automatically courtship. Still, the possibility that movement was beginning to work in both directions made the story more interesting. This wasn't simply a case of Kaydee sitting around the nest while Shadow ignored her. They were increasingly occupying the same parts of the territory, the same trees, the same nest area, the same roosting environment, and sometimes the same branch. But proximity creates another question. How close is too close? Kaydee tried again. One of the clearest examples came at the roost tree. The two eagles were already close. Kaydee then moved toward Shadow and appeared to nibble at him. For viewers who had been watching their earlier interactions, The moment might have looked familiar. Kaydee had previously shown a willingness to initiate close contact, but Shadow's response this time was difficult to miss. He pecked toward her head. Kaydee moved back. It was brief. There was no prolonged fight, no dramatic chase through the forest, no evidence that Shadow was attempting to drive Kaydee completely out of the territory. But the message in that moment appeared straightforward. Space. And then Kaydee did something revealing. She came closer again. Rather than leaving the area entirely, she attempted to settle near Shadow once more. Shadow vocalized, eventually. Kaydee created more distance. This is where it would be tempting to tell a very simple story. Shadow rejected Kaydee, but that would go beyond what the footage actually tells us. A bald eagle setting a boundary during one close interaction is not the same thing as permanently rejecting another eagle. Even bonded eagles do not necessarily welcome every approach at every moment. Individual birds have different tolerance levels. Context matters, timing matters, and Shadow's behavior needs to be understood across many interactions, not just one. Still, something was becoming clearer. Kaydee appeared willing to test the distance between them, and Shadow was willing to tell her when that distance became too small. Friends of Big Bear Valley later described Shadow as becoming a bit testy with Kaydee during this period. That description fits what viewers had begun seeing, but it also raised a much bigger question. Was Shadow becoming less tolerant of Kaydee? Or were we simply beginning to see the normal boundaries that develop when two eagles spend increasing amounts of time around each other? There was no way to know yet. And then August 27 arrived, the morning after. Morning came quietly to Big Bear Valley. Before sunrise, the nest sat empty. The camera moved through the familiar landscape, searching among the dark silhouettes of the pines as daylight slowly reached the valley. There was no dramatic confrontation, no close contact, no obvious courtship behavior, just the territory waking up. Eventually, an eagle could be seen near the familiar nest area. It was the kind of quiet footage that can seem insignificant when viewed by itself. But by now, every appearance of Shadow and Kaydee carried additional context. They had shared the nest. They had moved sticks. They had occupied nearby branches. Kaydee had followed Shadow. There had been close beak-to-beak contact. They had shared roosting areas, and now Shadow had also shown that proximity had limits. The morning itself didn't answer what was happening between them, but later that day, the story became more interesting. Shadow returned to the nest. He spent time inspecting the area and remained around the front porch for more than an hour. He rested. He preened. This was familiar territory for him. Eventually, Shadow left the nest area and moved toward the roost tree. Then Kaydee appeared, not long after Shadow's departure. She was seen in the basement area below the nest. Once again, Kaydee was using the same important territory Shadow had just occupied, and later she too moved toward the roost tree. This is where the events of the previous days become important, because if Shadow's earlier reaction had represented a complete unwillingness to tolerate Kaydee nearby, we might expect the pattern to break. Instead, the camera eventually found both eagles at the roost tree, together again, not engaged in some spectacular courtship display, not mating, not feeding one another, not providing definitive proof of a pair bond. They were simply there. Both eagles preened, both settled into the area, and eventually they prepared to spend the night. After the peck, after the vocalizations, after Shadow had demanded more space. Kaydee had returned to the same roosting area, and Shadow remained there. That changes how we should look at the earlier tension. A boundary is not the end of the story. Perhaps the most interesting thing about Shadow and Kaydee right now is that their behavior refuses to fit neatly into a simple narrative. If we only watched their closest moments, we might conclude that a new pair was already forming. If we only watched Shadow push Kaydee back, we might conclude the exact opposite. Neither conclusion is justified yet. The reality captured by the cameras is more complicated. Kaydee continues to approach. Shadow sometimes allows remarkable proximity. At other times, he asks for distance. Kaydee moves away, and then later they may be near each other again. That doesn't make their interactions less meaningful. It makes them more interesting. Relationships between wild animals aren't written like human stories. There isn't necessarily a single moment when everything changes. Behavior develops through repetition, tolerance, response, movement, shared space, and eventually patterns. That is why the nest matters. It's why shared roosting matters. It's why Kaydee moving sticks matters. It's why following behavior is worth documenting. And it's also why Shadow's moments of resistance matter. Each observation adds another piece, but none of them alone gives us the entire answer. What is Kaydee doing? Kaydee's behavior has been remarkably persistent. She keeps using the territory. She keeps returning to the nest. She has manipulated nest material. She continues appearing near Shadow. And even after interactions where Shadow clearly seemed to want additional space, she hasn't simply vanished. That persistence could become important as the season progresses. But there is something we still haven't seen clearly enough to make a major claim. There has been no confirmed mating, no clear courtship feeding, no unmistakable sequence that allows us to say a new breeding pair has been established. Those milestones would carry much greater significance. For now, what we have is association, repeated association, and increasing familiarity with the same territory. That may be the real story. Kaydee is no longer just an eagle that happened to pass through once. She has become a recurring presence in Shadow's environment. The remaining uncertainty belongs mostly to Shadow. What is Shadow doing? Shadow hasn't driven Kaydee away from every important location. He has shared the nest with her. He has remained during close interactions. He has occupied nearby perches. He has shared a roosting area, and yet he has also demonstrated that his tolerance isn't unlimited. That distinction could become extremely important over the coming months. A raptor biologist familiar with Kaydee has already suggested that the two appear to be forming a pair bond, and that there is a meaningful possibility they could become a pair. But possibility isn't confirmation, and Friends of Big Bear Valley has remained appropriately cautious. Big Bear's more significant nesting activity typically increases later in the year, particularly through October and November, before becoming stronger as December approaches. In other words, August may be giving us the beginning of a pattern rather than its conclusion. Shadow doesn't have to make some dramatic decision today, neither does Kaydee. What matters is what they continue doing. Will Kaydee keep visiting the nest? Will Shadow increasingly accept her there? Will they begin moving sticks together more often? Will shared roosting become routine? Will their vocal exchanges change? Will Shadow begin seeking Kaydee rather than simply tolerating her arrival? And perhaps most importantly, will we eventually see unmistakable courtship behavior? Those are the clues worth waiting for. The next chapter. For now, the most accurate description of Shadow and Kaydee may also be the most intriguing. They are still figuring out the distance between them. Kaydee has repeatedly tried to make that distance smaller. Shadow hasn't always agreed. Sometimes he stays. Sometimes he reacts. Sometimes Kaydee backs away. And then somehow later the two appear in the same place again. That happened at the Roost, and it may happen many more times. So perhaps Shadow's recent behavior shouldn't be viewed as the end of Kaydee's story. It may simply be the first time we're clearly seeing his boundaries inside it. Because the important thing isn't that Shadow pecked toward Kaydee once, it's what happened afterward. Kaydee stayed in the territory. She continued using the nest area. She eventually moved toward the same roost, and that evening, the two eagles were once again sharing the same part of the Big Bear Forest. No dramatic resolution, no confirmed new pair, just two bald eagles, a little distance between them, and a story that remains completely open. Over the next several weeks, that distance may tell us more than any single dramatic encounter ever could. If Shadow begins closing it himself, that would be worth watching. If Kaydee continues returning to the nest and Shadow increasingly joins her, that would be worth watching. If nest work becomes coordinated, that would be worth watching. And if courtship feeding, mating behavior, or other stronger pair bond behaviors eventually appear, then the story will have entered an entirely different stage. But we're not there yet. For now, Kaydee keeps returning. Shadow keeps responding, sometimes gently, sometimes not, and on August 27, despite everything that had happened between them. When night approached Big Bear Valley, they were still there, together in the same roosting area. Maybe not as close as Kaydee would have chosen, maybe closer than Shadow would have allowed only days before. We can't know what either eagle intends, but we can keep watching what they do. Because with Shadow and Kaydee, the next important clue may not come from a dramatic confrontation. It may be something much quieter, a shared branch, a stick carried to the nest, one eagle following the other, or simply Shadow choosing not to move away.